Olá, turma! Todo mundo aí curtindo o carnaval. E que bom, que especial, porque é isso aí, a gente precisa de um tempo de descanso, um tempo de festa. Mas a gente aqui preparou uma surpresa para vocês. E todos os dias, nesse feriado de carnaval, no horário do ICL Notícias, a gente vai passar para vocês uma aula especial, uma entrevista especial, para vocês que estão acostumados todos os dias a nos encontrar nesse horário, poderem, enfim, curtir um presente nosso, tá bom? Aproveitem aí e comentem, compartilhem, façam tudo aquilo que a gente pede para vocês fazerem para fazer essa mensagem chegar ao maior número de pessoas possível. Um abraço! Okay, Mr. Danny Glover.
All right.
First of all, thanks so much for your time. It's a great honor to be here, not only in front of the actor, Danny Glover, but the activist, the person who travels the world as an ambassador for like a new vision of the world, which is a possible world less unequal and less cruel, I would say, to most of the population that lives in this earth. I would like to start asking you, how did you get to know the landless movement of Brazil?
It's a pretty easy way of interaction or getting to know something. When I first heard about the landless movement, I wanted to know about that movement. I understood the MST was a part of the triad that was formed in 1985 after the end of the Brazilian dictatorship, military dictatorship, the Workers' Party, Curta, and MST. But MST was the most interesting from the standpoint that it dealt with the basic proposition of land and who owns the land and what the relationship to land is for poor people, and particularly poor people, but for rich as well. The history of what we say evolution of human beings, starting back in the 15th century, was the enclosure, was to move people off the land and move them into cities, as a way of controlling their movements and taking them away from something that's basic to human development. If you say human development and human existence is only 85,000 years, farming is only about 15,000 years. So the beginning of the idea of community in the real sense began with farming 15,000 years ago. So this basic element of human evolution, the land, is essential to how we see ourselves, perceive ourselves, and control our environment ourselves, and control the space which we consider to be community. And you find whenever that's taken away from poor people, you think about the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta gave poor people, or people who were landless people, to pillage the land that the knights and the nobles owned. So that was a major step in human relationship. That poor people have the right to do that. So all these advancements and everything, despite technology and everything else, we have more technology than you can imagine. And because farming has been become run by technology in a sense, machinery, and there's human hands, it's changed the nature of our relationship with the land. But the land is essential and important. And particularly now, because it's the one thing that we have in human society that regenerates itself season after season after season and season. So I wanted to meet I met Steadley in Venezuela on a visit to Venezuela, and that's where I first learned some years ago about the landless movement. And so I had an opportunity to come and visit its facility, not right outside of Sao Paulo, just an hour or so, an hour and a half outside of Sao Paulo. And what was remarkable about it was several things. One, that it was a collective of people who had an idea, and also a vision of another relationship that human beings have with each other and the land. Secondly, it was international. They were internationalists. So you had men and women who were organizers, maybe not even necessarily farmers, but men and women who were organizers from various other countries, and young people from around the globe, around the world. So those were some of the things that fascinated me about it. Then I learned more about it. I learned that it's the largest grower of organic rice in Brazil. And because of the relationship between the Workers' Party and the government and MST, they were able to provide lunches, food for the schools in Brazil, and also began to train men and women in farming. What do you say? What I would call accountable farming, or what's the word? I can't find a word for it. But sustainable farming.
Okay.
Sustainable farming and everything else. So those are the things that attracted me to it. And I think it's important that we address the land as we look at human viability, sustainability. We think about how the land in itself, in a sense, allows us to reimagine our relationship to each other. And also the other thing, if we look at global warming and climate change, our relationship with the land, Mother Earth, has to be transformed in some different way in order for us to sustain ourselves or to continue to exist as human beings in this world.
You know what is impressive because you're an American, you travel the world, but you're American. And after having lived at MST for a period of time, you know like much more of MST than 99.9% of the Brazilian. And people in Brazil think that MST is like a whole bunch of criminals, of people that like to invade farms and they like to just burn houses and they kill the cattle. How can you hide from the population a movement of 1 million, more than 1 million people? How can you put that much?
1.4 million people, 400,000 families, 1.4 million people. Over 1.4, yeah.
How can you hide that under the carpet from like a country like Brazil?
You create a narrative, you know, you criminalize them, first of all. That is the purpose of it. You don't talk about any of the things that they do, the positive things, the things in which they perhaps even enhance the lives of those people who are attempting to vilify them. So on the one hand, that's the narrative, because they're dangerous. They're dangerous. They're not propaganda in the real sense of it. What they're doing is taking action itself and reframing another narrative, and also redefining poverty and those people who are poor, and how they are the tools, or they are the instruments to change society. MST is an instrument to change society, period, without a doubt. So you have to kill that notion. You have to vilify it. You have to say that they're criminals and everything else, terrorists and everything else. And yet they are the ones who think about how do we now be self-sufficient? How do we provide basic food and needs for people, not simply those people? And one of the things is that the problem is there's enough land to grow food to feed the world. There's enough land. The question is that who owns the land, who controls the land, also controls the food line and the source of food. So that's the critical thing. So if people become self-sufficient in itself, not on a major. This is a major project. This project, even though we look at over 1.4 million people within a country of 200 million people, it's a small sample size in a sense, but it gives us it gives us an idea of what the possibilities are, and in terms of what it can do, and it changes the nature of not only the relationship that they have as farmers with the land, and they have control of the land. It builds self-esteem in themselves as well, and knowing that they have something of gift and a tool. But it also changes the relationship that those who live in the city have with those people who live in the land.
And you say something very interesting about the social relations they have, and you could see that when you were there, because human comes from humus. Humus, it's land, soil, from the world.
Yeah, of course.
And what I can feel is that this sense of community, it's much more strong in the land than in the urban centers, and it's much easier to control when you don't have this sense of community than when you have this sense of community.
Thank you. Exactly. You know, what are the factors that we've seen? We've seen since the landless movement is a process of depopulating the urban areas, in the sense. It doesn't push people into urban areas for their basic needs. It transforms what I need in relationship to what I want. If in the city, you're inundated, bombarded with all these things of what is considered what you need, but it's really what you want. So you're caught in the trap of being a wage earner. You're caught in the trap of all the propaganda of living in the city and all the kind of advantages, quote unquote, advantages, but they're not necessarily the advantages that, in this sense, establish another dynamic that you have with yourself as a human being. The idea of, as you said itself, when we're attached to the land, we're more human. And this is a different way for my own, because I come from farmers. Oh, my grandparents were farmers. Wow. My grandparents lived to be 99 years old. They were farmers. My grandfather had his own farm. At first, he did something because his mother, was freed from slavery, as a child. Okay, so in fact, African Americans were tied to the land by virtue of the fact of picking cotton. And cotton was the vehicle that made the United States, created the first primary wealth within the United States, cotton. So they were tied to the land in a sense. So my grandfather, born tied to the land. He ended up having different ways in which he had to barter his services in order to work the land, in order to eat and feed his family and stuff, until he was able to buy his own land and his own farm. And he was basically just a subsistent farmer. He was able to farm enough to provide enough food, most of his needs, grow his own, have his own meat, have his own chicken, have his own hogs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I know that. I spend time around it. So there's a different kind of relationship, even though I'm born right here in San Francisco, the city, that I have to the land itself and the importance of land. And I tell you, when I was a child, I met the most incredible people down there who were human in imaginable ways, who were kind in imaginable ways, who looked out for each other in community in imaginable. Even though they were poor, even though they were poor people, they often had generous people. They often had the capacity to share what they have. And that's the beautiful thing about that, and to look after each other, to care for each other in a different way. And they talk about that now. It's one of the aspects of what depopulation the land does, is it takes young people, because of all the systems of communication now, television, everything else, it takes them away from the land into the cities and places to get jobs, etc. But I come from that, so there's I have a different orientation when I see those people or be around those people. In fact, I had the opportunity in several of my movies to play someone who was a farmer, who was someone who owned the land, who was part of the land. And what I drew from, even as an actor, as an artist, what I drew from was my experience and the way in which I saw my grandparents and their relationship and people in their communities. That they weren't too far different than what I tried to portray in the movies, what I saw.
And they care for each other because when we lived in tribes, we knew that a tribe was as strong as the weakest people on the tribe. So
Exactly.
they had to care for the weak people to have a strong tribe.
Absolutely.
But like on a city, we see someone lying on the ground, like starving, and we just don't care about them. But we don't know that we are as weak as they are as a group.
Exactly.
And at MST
exactly.
and those people, they have that feeling that they cannot afford to have anyone weak if they want to be a strong group.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's very, very like important.
Well, MST is the most, I think, and the way in which it develops, the MST develops the relationships internationally with other groups around the world, not only in Latin America, but in Africa as well, or the organizations, like organization. They are the most imaginative part of I think, this transformation, the possible transformation of Brazil. Because you don't have a violent relationship with the land itself. You have a loving relationship with that. It's a loving relationship with that. It is not a caring relationship, and it is a relationship that is utilitarian. Mm-hmm. It is a relationship that uses everything that the land provides it. And in doing so, what it does is it transforms you. You know, it is not a wasteful relationship. It is a relationship of generosity and a spirit of generosity that comes out of that relationship. Because the basic thing, beyond what it is, the basic thing is how we feed and nourish our bodies. We're not. When we discovered 15,000 years ago that there was a thing called farming, and that comes out of farming comes as a part of around the woman's cycle. Mm-hmm. Farming is a result of that, the woman's cycle, menstrual cycle. And as you come into this thing, you come in and you find the building of civilization with farming. You know, the Egyptian army was the most powerful army in the world because the Nile River was the most fertile. Yes. When the Nile flooded, it provided all those minerals and all those things that were necessary for to revitalize the land and make the land more productive.
One last question. At MST, it's very interesting because they don't have like a single male leadership. Mm-hmm. All the leadership is shared amongst men and women, elderly and young people, mm-hmm. Black and white. Mm-hmm. And they told me that is on purpose, to have representative people caring for all of them. And the last time I was there, they told me, Eduardo, do you know that MST is the largest organized Black movement in the world, as most of people that are on the MST are Black people?
Well, so that's what we don't know.
Yeah, I never knew that.
We don't know, because all those places which are isolated, are isolated.
I mean, social movement.
And the social movement.
Yeah.
All those places that the farming that you find, where you find people on land and farming, where are the most isolated, out of the way of the urban areas, out of the way of the news forecasts and all that, everything else. We don't get that information, you know. But it's important to understand that, because the largest population, as self-identified population in Brazil, is of African descent.
Exactly.
It's African descent.
And more than 100 years ago, they were slaves in Brazil. We are the last country in the world to abolish slavery.
Yeah.
So it's a movement that gives the possibility of freedom to Black people in one of the most racist countries in the world. Isn't that like strong for MST to?
I think it's important to acknowledge that the work that MST is doing, and that it promotes the kind of leadership and the ideology around sustainability and purpose, the ideology around building a different humanity resides right there in that. And I think it's important at this particular time in Brazil's history, because we know at the same time the death of young black males in the favelas in Brazil is the highest death rate of any place of black males in the world. In those places, we have to understand that, and we have to understand that the primary forces against those African descendants are from the violent forces that maintained slavery up until 100 years ago, and sustain the exploitation of Africans as well as all poor people, indigenous people, and other people in Brazil. And we have to understand that MST in this act right there of one, the land, its relationship to the land, is the fact that the majority of them of African descent are those who are part of MST, those who have benefited from the more than 1.4 million people who are on land, a vacant land, a grazing land. Those are very important. This is the conversation that doesn't get out. This is the conversation that first of all, you criminalize the action itself. You know, it's the same way. It's bringing people together across Brazil, unlike any other organization. It does that, and I think that it is important for us to get that information out, particularly, and that it is the link to the possibilities of another future for Brazil.
MST, they don't like speculate with the land. They actually never own the land. They can just use the land, right? And by having this necessity of caring for the land, because the land is going to care for them, because they cannot sell the land one day, so they have to take care of them. They value the land much more than a guy who just buy a land to sell later in the world, in his life would do. This relationship with the land is something that I want quickly to explore, because we're losing this relationship with the land and seeing just as another asset that we want to buy and see it like going up on the stock market or something like that. And the other thing is, the people from MST, they are largely independent. If there's hyperinflation in Brazil, nothing changed in their lives.
Yeah.
And that bothers a lot of people, that they're not dependent on, they cannot like blackmail them. Oh, if you don't do that, you're gonna lose this or lose that. They have everything that they want. Do you think that one of the reasons why MST is so much persecuted is because they are like they have the ability to be independent from these capitalism traps?
Well, I think while they supply the basic needs of who we are, what we need as human beings, food. Food has been for some time, and I don't know, for some time in the Western world, and for some time in the world itself, commodified in a way. The relationship that we have for food as a commodity, it's become even more commodified in ways in which it's capable. The lack of food often is capable of destabilizing a community, destabilizing a country. The access to that food, you know, and you take, for instance, Kenya at the time of its independence. Its primary foreign exchange was through agriculture, because it supplied the whole region around it in the southern part of Africa, the southeastern part of Africa. So now it becomes tourism. So food has been commodified to the point of removed from access and people's viability connected to access, and the reason to that a reason of connecting it to the other parts of Africa. Within its close proximity to itself, and that is what is happening with food. So the fact that that the food now is what that is. You whether it's you own your stock market, you have different things around profits on shares around hogs or beef or meat and all those things. In fact, one of the greatest crimes that we do now in terms of food and hogs and growing animal is that it is the largest emitter of HO2 gases. The way we produce meat.
That is true.
Simply, it's not the cars we drive, but the way we produce meat, in a sense. So it has been commodified and changed the nature and the relationship in that. And that is to not only that, to various different MNO. I mean, those modified organic, modified different formulas in which I can't find the word. I'm sorry, I'm rambling now. I did GMOs. The fact that we have the GMOs in the situation. Thank you very much. So the GMOs. And none of these are GMO crops, so you're not in the MST doesn't use those kind of methods in terms of farming.
That is true.
It brings us back. It changes the narrative, and it introduces another narrative for all of us as human beings, whether we live in the rural areas or whether we live in cities. That's what it does. And I think it is dangerous because for them, for power, it is dangerous. And I think that while it is, I think the most radical part of the, and I'm using the word radical in the sense that it's transformative, is the most transformative part of the agenda after 1985. It is the one that is most endangered as well, because of the idea. It transforms our mind. It takes us out of the system in which dictates, is often the dictator of what is happening in the society, and puts us in another way of looking at it. If we look at that way, it's a frightening way for people to try to change their orientation. And that is that is what MST does. Is it changes our orientation, our relationship to food, and by virtue of that, it changes our orientation and our relationship to each other.
Thanks so much for the interview.
Okay.
And it's very important to have someone that is world known like you, talking about a movement that in Brazil should be an example and maybe a solution, and people see as a problem.
Oh no! It is a solution for not only Brazil, but it's a solution to other impoverished countries in the world. It is the resistance to eliminate and demonize MST is a war on all people around the world, poor people specifically around the world.
Great.
All right.